Hello there, my lovelies. My name is Boomy and you're watching my channel, Boomy Reactions. Now today, guys, we're going to be catching up with a geography video. I feel like I haven't watched a good geography video for a while. So going back to more American geography, this video has been requested by one of my absolutely wonderful patrons. This is from Missy. Thank you so much for your support, Missy, and thank you for requesting this. What I think will be a very interesting video. So, Missy, you say some more on American geography. Yes. And you're very excited to hear about more about the Appalachian Mountains. Oh my gosh, me too. I think it's such a unique mountain range. It's one of the oldest ones, isn't it? Right, guys? So I forget how old. I've got a memory of a goldfish. Definitely one of the oldest mountainous regions. So what, presumably like some of the oldest forests in the world. Distinctly unique culture-wise. Oh my gosh, the biodiversity and just it's absolutely beautiful. So here you've got the mountains. So we've got the White Mountains, the Catskills, and the Smoky Mountains. They're the ones in the south, aren't they? Just trying to catch myself up on a bit of geography knowledge before we go in there. And I did not realize that long ago that the Appalachian Mountains literally span all the way from Canada to Alabama. I don't know why. I thought it was kind of just located in like West Virginia, those kind of states along there. I didn't actually realize until recently that it stretches all the way up 2,000 miles on, isn't it? It's absolutely amazing. It's huge. It's very vast and beautiful. So I am with you, Missy. I'm very excited to be learning a little bit more about the Appalachian Mountains. Although I think I'm a little bit lost on the context of the videos. This video is called Why America's Geography is Unfair. In regards to the Appalachian Mountains, I suppose like early settlers maybe would have thought it was the most unfair thing in the world to travel all the way across the ocean to be confronted with a huge barrier of a mountain range with very little chance of getting past these mountains. Is that why it's unfair? No, I have absolutely no idea what this video is going to tell us about the how unfair America's geography is. So let's just get straight into it, shall we, guys? And as ever, if you're enjoying these reactions, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much, my lovelies. Oh, God. Bit of a rough throat at the minute. I don't know where this is coming from because I talk too much. If you're interested, I have a Buy Me Coffee account. That link is over here. And if you would like to help support my channel any further, I have a Patreon account. And if you want to check that out at all, that link is in the description below there. Right, okay. Let's go.
For over a century, the Appalachian Mountains were viewed as a curse. They were a rugged, impenetrable wall that trapped the early American colonies against the Atlantic Ocean. But geographies now argue that this prison was actually a blessing. By stopping early expansion, these mountains forced the colonies to densify, industrialize, and unify. I'm Jeff, and this is the story of how a geographic wall built a superpower.
Oh, okay. Oh, flipping that curse on its... Yeah, I like that. Okay, so yeah, to early settlers, like I said, it would have been a bit of a bummer to travel all that way. And then that's it for westward expansion. That's it. That's where you're going to stay. So I imagine it kind of acted like a little bit of a hotspot for an awful lot of different cultures from different countries and settling in these areas. And that's how come you've got such this diverse culture all throughout the Appalachians. There was another reason why westward expansion was banned, I think. Wasn't it? Was it banned by the Crown, by England? Big surprise there. But I think the reason why they didn't want any more westward expansion, I think isn't totally selfish, I guess. I think they didn't want any more confrontation. So like following the 7-Year War with France, I think they didn't want any more confrontation with the natives. So they didn't want to anger them anymore with any more, encroaching on their territory. That's the textbook answer. I think there's probably, in Britain, during that time era, there was probably a lot more self-interest going on there. Like they want to hold people back and just make sure all the lords and the higher ups get there first. Go and claim your land, lads. Off you go. We'll hold them back. I don't know. Yeah, something tells me there's probably a little bit more self-interest going on there. The immovable wall.
Before we can understand how this massive geologic barrier forged a country, we have to first understand the wall itself. What exactly are the Appalachian Mountains? To look at them on a standard topographic map today, they don't actually seem all that intimidating, stretching for roughly 1,500 miles from the island of Newfoundland in Canada all the way down to central Alabama in the United States.
Oh, hang on, he said 1,500 miles. I thought it was 2,000 miles. Did I get that wrong? Sorry, guys, I probably got that wrong.
The Appalachians are a sprawling, massive system of mountain ranges. And unlike the jagged, snow-capped, dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains out west, the Appalachians are draped in lush, dense green forests. They are famously rounded and rolling, and they rarely exceed 6,000 feet in elevation. In fact, Mount Mitchell in North Carolina takes the crown as the highest peak at just 6,684 feet. For context, the state of Colorado alone has over 50 peaks that double that height. So, if they aren't dizzyingly high, why were they such a formidable wall for so long? The answer lies...
I think they were just not surpassable. There was no obvious safe route through. Am I right in thinking that, guys?
Their unique layout. The Appalachians aren't just one single convenient ridge that you can climb up and over. They're a complex maze of parallel ridges and deep, narrow valleys. There's actually a whole subregion specifically known as the Ridge and Valley Appalachians. If you were an early settler trying to go west, you wouldn't just cross one mountain. You would chop your way through dense, untamed forests, climb up a steep ridge, descend into a valley, and then immediately face another identical ridge, and then another, and another. There were almost no natural east to west rivers or mountain passes to make the journey easier.
So it's a chunky mountain range. It's not just one mountain all the way dotted along this range here. It's just, I don't know, like a little bit of a labyrinth. Like it's this. I was just gonna say this mountain range has got girth. Don't be rude. There's nothing wrong with what I just said.
Mountains you see today are hiding a monumental secret. Their modest, rolling appearance is completely deceptive. Because to truly understand the Appalachians, you have to look back not thousands of years, but millions. You see, the Appalachians weren't always the gentle green hills we know today. In fact, there was a time when these very mountains would have made the modern Himalayas look small. The Appalachian Mountains are incredibly, almost unfathomably old. They first began forming roughly 480 million years ago during the Ordovician period. This makes them older than the rings of Saturn. It makes them older than bones and older than trees even.
Older than the rings of Saturn. I thought it was something like 1 billion years ago. Have I just grossly over-exaggerated a fact there? I may have, but still one of the oldest mountain ranges.
Appalachian Mountains were first rising out of the earth. Life on our planet was still mostly confined to the oceans. For hundreds of millions of years, the Earth's tectonic plates smashed into one another in a slow-motion geologic war. As the ancient continental plates of North America and Africa collided, the crust buckled, thrusting the Earth upward. During this violent era of mountain building, geologists believed the jagged peaks of the Appalachians likely soared to elevations comparable to the Himalayas today, perhaps even reaching 30,000 feet or more into the sky. So where did all that rock go? Time and water explains it all.
Oh my gosh, just before we moved on, I feel a little bit left out representing the UK here. I just want to pipe up and say that when all the other continents were all together in Pangaea, I think no later, yeah, it must have been Pangaea, the Appalachians also included the Welsh mountains and the Scottish Highlands and the mountains there. So, hello neighbour, hello cousin. So yeah, we were all kind of part of one, and the mountain range included the Welsh mountains. I found that out quite recently. I was very excited, I have to tell you. I feel a bit left out because he didn't mention it here. It's not just Africa, we were there too, yay.
Because the Appalachians are so incredibly old, they have been subjected to hundreds of millions of years of relentless erosion.
Weathering and
Rain, wind,
erosion,
freezing ice,
yeah.
and thawing summers literally ground these Himalayan-sized peaks down to the rounded nubs we see today. The sediment from these massive ancient mountains slowly washed away, gradually creating the flat, fertile coastal plains of the eastern seaboard, the very land that would eventually sustain the early American colonies. But as the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea assembled and then violently tore itself apart, it left behind a geographic mystery. What if I told you that to find the rest of the Appalachian Mountains, you'd have to leave the North American continent completely? When the continents were fused together into Pangaea about 300 million years ago, the Appalachians were just the central section of a massive, continuous mountain chain known as the Central Pangaean Mountains. This mega range acted as the rocky spine of the supercontinent. When Pangaea eventually broke apart, the newly formed Atlantic Ocean flooded into the rift, separating the continents and ripping the mountain range into pieces. The central chunk stayed in North America and became the Appalachians, but the eastern edge was carried away on the African tectonic plate. Today, those mountains still stand proudly in Morocco. We call them the Anti-Atlas Mountains. Meanwhile, the northernmost section of this ancient chain were dragged off on the Eurasian plate. If you travel to the UK and hike the dramatic misty peaks of the Scottish Highlands, or explore the rugged mountains of Scandinavia, you're actually walking on the exact same rock formations. Geologically speaking, the Scottish Highlands, the Atlas Mountains, and the Appalachians are all the exact same mountain range.
Oh, you didn't mention Wales. I'm sure I've read that it includes the Welsh mountains. Oh.
Separated only by an ocean of time and water. This ancient, eroded, continent-spanning wall is what awaited the first European settlers. It was a dense, dark, and seemingly endless labyrinth of ridges and valleys that effectively shut the door to the interior of the North American continent. But a mountain range is more than just rocks and trees. For thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived, this rugged landscape was already home to complex human societies that knew exactly how to navigate the impenetrable. So, how did the early indigenous groups survive the labyrinth? And what exactly happened when a rapidly expanding colonial wave of colonial settlers finally crashed into that immovable wall?
That was one of the methods that they got through the Appalachian Mountains, is because there were paths that natives had probably showed them or been hired to escort them through in order to pass through the mountains.
We're gonna see exactly how those early nations navigated that massive labyrinth, and why European settlers were trapped behind it for over a century in just a second.
Breaking through the wall.
When European settlers looked west from the Atlantic coast, they saw an impenetrable fortress of wood and stone. But to the indigenous peoples of North America, the Appalachian Mountains were never really a wall. They were a home, a fortress, and a bustling network of highways. For over 10,000 years, Native American nations navigated the complex ridges and deep valleys that terrified the early Europeans. In the north, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy dominated the terrain, using the geography to control trade and protect their borders. In the south, the Cherokee built sprawling, sophisticated towns in the river valleys, perfectly adapting their agricultural practices to the mountain climate. In fact, long before Europeans ever set foot on the continent, a sprawling path known as the Great Indian Warpath ran the length of the Appalachians, connecting tribes from modern-day New York all the way to Alabama. But in the 17th century, a new force arrived on the eastern shores of the continent, and the balance of the mountains was about to be shattered. When the first English colonists established Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620, they clung tightly to the Atlantic coastal plain. For the first century and a half of American colonial history, European settlement barely pushed inland. Why? Because geography dictated their limits. The early colonies relied heavily on navigable rivers to transport goods like tobacco and timber back to Europe. But just a few dozen miles inland, the coastal rivers hit something called the fall line, a geographic boundary where the soft, flat sediment of the coast meets the hard bedrock of the Piedmont region, creating waterfalls and rapids that both simply couldn't pass. Beyond the fall line loomed the blue, hazy ridges of the Appalachians. To the British Crown, this geographic barrier was incredibly convenient. In fact, after the French and Indian War, the British government issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This law literally drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and made it strictly illegal for colonists to settle west of it. The British wanted to keep the colonists neatly penned against the coast where they could be easily taxed, governed, and controlled, while leaving
I gave a really optimistic reason for, or a nice reason why the Crown would have done this, to avoid further conflict with the natives. I knew there would be a much more self-motivated, self-interest reason. because it kept the colonies closer together next to the ocean, and they were easier to control and easier to tax.
The deep interior to their Native American allies. But a geographic wall and a political line were no match for the desire for more land. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were experiencing a massive population boom. Coastal farmlands were becoming exhausted, and a new generation of Americans were desperate for land, and so they looked west. They knew vast, fertile plains existed on the other side of the mountains, but every attempt to cross with wagons, livestock, and families was thwarted by the endless, brutal ridges of the Appalachians. So, how do you cross an uncrossable mountain range? Well, you don't climb over it. You just gotta find the crack where you can squeeze through. Deep in the intersection of modern-day Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, geography had provided a miraculous loophole.
No, I thought it was more the kind of middle of the range that, that the settlers were able to get in between now.
Millions of years ago, a meteorite strike weakened the bedrock in a specific area of the mountains. Over countless millennia, a river carved through this weakened rock, leaving behind a deep V-shaped notch in an otherwise solid ridge. This is the Cumberland Gap. While indigenous people had used this gap for centuries, it wasn't until 1750 that a colonial explorer named Dr. Thomas Walker documented it for the Europeans. But the man who blew the doors wide open was a frontiersman named Daniel Boone. In 1775, Boone and a team of axemen hacked a 200-mile trail through the Cumberland Gap, creating the Wilderness Road. It was far from a modern highway, though. The Wilderness Road was a brutal, steep, muddy, and dangerous path. Wagons frequently shattered, pack animals died, and violent clashes with the Cherokee and Shawnee, who were desperately trying to defend their ancestral lands from this sudden invasion, were a constant reality. The conquering of the Appalachians was not a peaceful expansion. It was a devastating displacement of the indigenous population who had thrived there for thousands of years.
I think if you were able to migrate your way through the mountain range, I think maybe there was an element of luck about it, or you had an incredibly knowledgeable guide that got you through, but still there would probably have to be a good element of luck going on there in regards to the weather, natural disasters, or just the terrain itself, and the likelihood of an attack from the indigenous people.
Yet, despite the extreme hardships, the crack in the wall had been found. The floodgates opened. Within just a few decades, over 300,000 settlers poured through the Cumberland Gap, spilling out into the vast, open plains of the Ohio River Valley. The immovable wall had finally been breached. The United States was suddenly untethered, beginning its rapid, unstoppable march towards the Pacific Ocean. But conquering the mountains is only half the story. Because while the American pioneers eventually broke through to the other side, geographers argue that the true secret to American dominance isn't that they crossed the Appalachians. It's that they were trapped behind them for 150 years.
Oh. The prison that built
We've seen how the impenetrable geography of the Appalachians kept European colonists confined to the Atlantic coast. And we've seen the sheer willpower it took to finally punch a hole through that wall. But geographies point to a fascinating historic what if that changes how we view these mountains entirely. What if the east coast of North America had been as flat and open as the Great Plains? What if those early settlers had met no resistance and could have simply walked endlessly westward from the moment they landed?
Oh, that's a very sad what if. You might not actually have all the cultural diversity of the Appalachians.
If that had happened, the United States as we know it today likely wouldn't exist. Without a
or
geographic barrier to stop them, early colonists would have immediately dispersed. They would have spread out thinly across millions of square miles of the vast American interior. They would have formed isolated, disconnected farming communities, scattered from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Without proximity to one another, they wouldn't have needed to build massive coastal trade networks. And they certainly wouldn't have developed a unified, shared identity. By trapping the colonists against the ocean for 150 years, the Appalachian Mountains forced something crucial: densification. Because they couldn't expand outward, the 13 colonies had to build upward and inward. They built deep water ports. They constructed dense, bustling cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Because expanding west was impossible, they turned their economic focus north and south, trading heavily with one another along the coastline. This forced economic reliance bred a shared political and cultural identity. 13 incredibly distinct, wildly different colonies were squished together until they began to see themselves as a single, unified entity. But how did this forced proximity defeat the greatest military empire on Earth? When the American Revolution erupted, that coastal densification became the colony's greatest weapon. Because the American population was concentrated along the eastern seaboard, they could communicate quickly, organize militias, and maintain relatively short supply lines. If the colonial population had been scattered across the Midwest, the British military would have easily divided and conquered them piecemeal. The Appalachian Mountains literally guarded the Americans' backs, preventing the British from easily flanking them from the deep interior.
That is such an interesting point, isn't it? So yeah, if all of the settlers had been dispersed across the continent, arguably it could have potentially been easier for Britain to, you know, to overcome the armies. That would have looked like a very different America, wouldn't it? Whew.
In short, the geographic prison of the Appalachians incubated the United States. It gave the country the time, the density, and the industrial foundation it needed to survive its early fragile years. By the time the country finally spilled through the Cumberland Gap and breached the mountains in the early 1800s, they weren't just a loose band of vulnerable farmers anymore. They were an industrializing, unified country with a centralized government, a booming population, and a rapidly advancing technologic base. And they were going to need every ounce of that industrial power, because out west, a much more terrifying geographic monster awaited. If the early colonists had somehow bypassed the Appalachians and immediately hit the sheer, jagged 14,000-foot peaks of the Rocky Mountains or the unforgiving deserts of the Great Basin, the westward expansion would have completely collapsed. They simply wouldn't have had the technology or the numbers to survive it. The Appalachians acted as the perfect set of training wheels for American expansion. By forcing the US to industrialize first, the country was prepared for the West. By the time Americans had to cross the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas, they weren't just relying on wooden wagons. They were laying down thousands of miles of transcontinental railroads, stringing up telegraph wires, and using the massive manufacturing base they had built back east. The wall that once held them back had prepared them to conquer a continent. But while the United States moved on to dominate the West, what happened to the mountains themselves? Today, the Appalachian Mountains are no longer a barrier to transportation. Highways tunnel right through the ancient bedrock, and airplanes soar effortlessly over the rolling green ridges. Yet,
still regions that are fairly isolated though, isn't there?
The mountains remain a vital, irreplaceable part of the American fabric. Physically, they became the engine of the American Industrial Revolution. For over a century, the incredibly rich coal seams buried deep within the Appalachian bedrock powered the country's factories, heated its homes, and fueled the trains that connected the coasts. Today, they're also one of the country's greatest natural playgrounds, home to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the country, and the legendary Appalachian Trail, a 2,190-mile continuous footpath that stretches from Georgia to Maine. But beyond the physical, Appalachia exists today as one of the most distinct cultural regions in the United States. The deep, isolated valleys that once trapped early pioneers eventually created pockets of unique, incredibly preserved culture. The region birthed entirely new genres of American music, like bluegrass and country, rooted in the Scottish and Irish heritage of the people who settled the harsh ridges. It's a region of its own distinct dialects, folklore, and deeply ingrained traditions of self-reliance. And because of that, the Appalachians remain the most important mountain range in North America, even if they're just tiny nubs compared to the Rockies. For over a century, the Appalachian Mountains were viewed as a curse, a rugged, impenetrable wall of tree and stone. But history has actually proven otherwise. By standing in the way, this ancient, eroded mountain range forced 13 colonies to stop, grow together, and build the foundation for an industrial powerhouse. So the Appalachians didn't trap the United States, it forged it. This week, I'm in Guatemala, hiking up to the top of an active volcano to watch it erupt and answer the question, why are Central America's volcanoes so much more active than North America's? So come join me over on my travel channel. I hope you enjoyed learning all about the Appalachian Mountains. If you did, be sure to check out this video all about how Minnesota shaped the United States. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Yeah, I was a bit confused. He's talking about the next video, nothing to do with this one. I'm gonna risk saying this and making myself sound like a little bit of a nerd. How exciting was that? Yes, I found that very exciting. I had never thought of the early settlers encountering the Appalachian Mountains. I'd always seen it as, like the narrator said, you know, it would have maybe at first been considered a curse or just a huge barrier to westward expansion. Absolutely. But it wasn't. There is a silver lining. It forced an awful lot of, not just industrialization, it forced, I don't know, like a sense of unity, solidarity, an identity, maybe. I think that's so cool. Yes, I'm showing my inner nerd now. I love history, love a bit of geography, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. So there we are. The identity of arguably modern USA, shaped very heavily by the Appalachian Mountains. I think that's amazing. So yeah, absolutely fabulous. Can you imagine? It's the War for Independence could have gone differently if the Appalachian Mountains weren't there. So early settlers didn't encounter that barrier and dispersed all in the early days, dispersed across the continent. Could have gone differently, couldn't it? Yikes. That was so interesting. Oh my gosh, guys, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. Like I said, yeah, my inner nerd is totally showing now. I can't help it. I just find it really interesting. It is. So thank you, Missy, for requesting that video. Gosh, ooh. Watch me scatter off now and run and go and tell Dave. So yes, thank you for requesting that video. So interesting. Guys, I really hope you found that as interesting as I did. Take care of yourselves, my lovelies, and I will see you on the next video. Bye-bye.